The next time you're on Pinterest, high-level physics might be behind what you see. I'm Tanya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Asin Ashraf. He is a data scientist at Pinterest. Welcome, Asin.
Thanks for having me, Tanya.
You come from a physics background. How does the physics background you have relate to your current role at Pinterest?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before I started Pinterest, I was working in complex systems, which is a field of physics where we try to understand systems that are really hard to pin down with specific equations. And Pinterest is actually a pretty complex ecosystem. And so I actually try to do the same thing here, which is I try to make sense of our data and I try to make better recommendations for our users.
A part of your job involves recommender systems. Start by describing what a recommender system is.
Yeah, so a recommender system is essentially trying to answer the question of if I have a user and if I show them a specific item, and this item could be an image, a book, a movie, anything really, how likely are is this user to actually like that or comment on it or interact with it in some way or the other? And so on Pinterest, that item is a pin. A pin is an image that links to a specific web page. And when our users come on, what we're trying to figure out is, well, what are the types of things that this user will like, and how likely is it that they'll interact or kind of dive deeper into some of these things.
What are the primary drawbacks to recommender systems as we know them so far?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the big issues with recommender systems, or at least I should say simple or naive recommender systems, is that recommendations are at a per item, per user level. And so at the end of the day, what we're trying to answer is we're trying to say, hey, how likely is this user to look at this specific or interact with this specific pin or this item? But we're not taking into account the fact that users aren't just looking at one pin at a time. Users are looking at lots of things at the same time. And this is something that's kind of hard to actually take into account into a recommender system. So you may really like horror movies or some specific type of movies. And if we show you one or two of them, maybe you'll be really excited by it. But if all you see is the same thing, you might get kind of bored of it by some point. And that's one of the big drawbacks that we've seen in recommender systems so far.
How do you define diversity in the context of a recommender system?
Yeah, that's actually a great question because it's really hard to define, in fact. The way that we ended up approaching it is is on a content-specific basis. So the way that on Pinterest, when someone comes on and pins a pin, they give it a board. So a board is a collection of pins, which usually has a title. And then the pin also has a bunch of words associated with it. So these are descriptions, these are the link that the pin points to. These are the texts that are on the specific web page that it points to. And so we actually take a bunch of these words and we put them together into something that we call pin annotations. These annotations are just words that kind of describe the pin. And then based on those annotations, then we can kind of compare annotations across pins to try and figure out how different the two pins are. And when we have a collection of them, we try to do this. So there's a few different ways of defining that diversity metric. And so one specific simple way is called the type token ratio. This is the TTR. You take the unique number of annotations of words that you have, and then you divide it by the total number of annotations in your set of pins. So that's one example. Another example is using something from physics called entropy. Entropy is essentially trying to measure the amount of randomness in a system. In the context of Pinterest, what it translates to is that how likely are you to look at the next pin, or what is the additive amount of information that each pin is giving to your set of pins? And so this is actually a great measure to be able to try and understand what is the diversity in a system. And so this is actually one of the ways that you can take something from physics and use it in a recommender system, and it works reasonably well.
You mentioned the example of horror movies earlier. How do you go about selecting appropriate alternative content? What factors goes into those kind of decisions?
Yeah, so at Pinterest, we're quite lucky that we have this really nice, graph essentially, which is a user puts a bunch of pins on a specific board, but then those same pins can also be on other people's boards. And then this is kind of there's a lot of co-occurrence that happens across different boards. And so what we can do is we can look at one specific pin and see what other boards is this pin also belong to? And then we can kind of like look at this whole like system essentially together. And so it's a little bit of like a collaborative filtering approach, where we can kind of see that if you're into this horror movie, like what are other horror movies and other people's boards which also co-occur with this specific pin. And that's one of the examples of a way that we do this.
So I love the recommender systems. And in fact, I can get kind of addicted to them on a personal level, but how do you know if somebody is actually interested in the content beyond their preferred engagement topics?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to actually define a metric for success. I mean, that's kind of what this comes down to, which is like, how do we know that we're doing a good job? And we actually do a bunch of different things. So like, we obviously actually talk to people. We do a lot of user research where we try to understand, well, when we actually show users something, do they actually like it? Do they actually want to engage with this kind of stuff? And then we also like, measure, apart from just measuring things like, is this person actually interacting with this content? We also try to see how much time are they spending? Are they spending time that they actually feel like is good? And on Pinterest, we actually have something called Tried It, which is one of our, like kind of big things where we don't just want users to discover the things on Pinterest, but actually go out in their life and do those things. And so Tried It is a great way for users to actually tell us that, hey, they found this recipe and they actually made it in real life, and this is what it looked like. And so that it's a combination of a bunch of different things. But on Pinterest, we like our mission is to help you discover and do what you love. So it's not just about the discovery part, but also like a little bit about like how you actually go and do those things in real life.
What results have you seen from the inclusion of diversity in the recommender systems?
Yeah, so there's a few different approaches of actually putting this into it. We kind of ended up adding it to one of our steps in our ranking or recommendation pipeline, and this is kind of at the very last step. So our system essentially starts off with our big pin corpus, which is all the pins that we have. It goes through a bunch of different steps to try and like trim it and like try to rank it in different ways. And then finally, we have this place where we can fine tune the results. So we have about like, hundreds of pins for a specific session, for a specific user. And we're trying to understand how to actually tune this explore exploit kind of spectrum for this specific user and for this specific set of pins. And so when we do that really well, when we like don't entirely exploit the user's interests, but also give them some exploratory content, which is essentially adding diversity into their feed, we actually see that users come back to Pinterest more often. So we actually see more revisitation. And we also see that like, time spent goes up. So more users end up spending more time to take more actions and generally are happier. We've also done a lot of like user research on this, as I mentioned. So we like literally have pinners come in and like talk about their experience and ask them like, would you like to see more content diversity? What do you think about this? And so a lot of that research has also shown that some of this diversity actually makes users pretty happy.
Ahsan Ashraf, data scientist at Pinterest, helping diversify our pins and implementing those pins in real life. Thank you so much for your time. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to find out more about the work that you're doing, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just look for me and you should be able to find me.
And thanks again. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe go to my website, tanyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.